Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack something absolutely fascinating about the mechanics of late-night television. We're looking at a recent major shift in media that has completely transformed how audiences react to the person standing on stage. Now, to be clear, right up front, we're not here to take a political stance. Not at all. Instead, we're looking purely at the architecture of entertainment. We're analyzing what actually happens when the real world steps into a space that is entirely built for satire. To do this, we'll be looking at the specific case study of Stephen Colbert's monologues regarding Donald Trump, and we'll observe how the language used on that stage evolved from typical comedic fodder into something entirely different.
And that brings us to this central, honestly really compelling mystery. What happens when late-night comedy is forced to literally stop telling jokes? Just think about that for a second. The entire institution of the late-night monologue is built on clever setups, witty direction, and a perfectly delivered punchline. But what happens when the reality of the day's news is so incredibly heavy or legally finalized that trying to put a comedic spin on it actually takes away from its impact? How does an entertainer adapt when the plain facts of reality begin to alter the very foundation of their show? Well, let's find out.
Section 1, the late night shift. For years, Stephen Colbert operated right out of the standard comedian's playbook, crafting perfectly timed punchlines to dissect the daily news. And this timeline brilliantly illustrates the shifting landscape of his vocabulary. During the term, it was President Trump. After, it naturally transitioned to Donald Trump. Now, this is standard late-night handling of the passage of time, right? Subtle shifts in titles to help set up a joke. But in 2023, as the legal cases started stacking up, the vocabulary made a sharp, dramatic turn to Defendant Trump. Before we get into why that specific shift was so absolutely crucial, we kind of have to understand the traditional status quo of comedy. Laughter actually has limits. Written jokes, no matter how clever or perfectly timed they are, rely on exaggeration. They twist the truth just enough to surprise the listener. And because of that, the reaction is temporary. It fades. The studio audience goes home, the tension dissipates, and the comedian has to hit the reset button every single night to manufacture that laughter all over again. Section 2. Enter Defendant Trump. The introduction of this specific phrase in 2023 was a massive inciting incident for the show. When Colbert introduced Defendant Trump, the dynamic in the room fundamentally shifted. It hit so hard precisely because it wasn't an opinion. It wasn't satire. It was a direct, unfiltered reflection of reality. The audience didn't just chuckle, they erupted. And it carried a totally different kind of weight because it reminded every single person watching that this wasn't just a political figure giving speeches anymore. This was someone actively facing real-world criminal charges. You could actually feel the shift in the studio. Night after night, Colbert just kept repeating the phrase, "Defendant Trump appeared in court. Defendant Trump's lawyers argued." It wasn't a punchline, it was impartial reporting of reality inserted right into a comedy monologue. And because of that, it created a brand new expected rhythm for the viewers. It bridged the gap between late-night entertainment and a very serious legal reality, literally conditioning the audience to respond to facts rather than just waiting for a punchline. Section 3, the ultimate punchline. Now, let's slow down a bit because in May of 2024, the reality grew even heavier. 11. That is the number of hours a Manhattan jury spent in deliberation. When you think about that time, those 11 hours were not entertainment. It was history unfolding in real time behind closed doors. The tension of those hours set the stage for an undeniable conclusion that no comedy writer could ever script. And that brings us to 34. After those 11 hours, the jury announced their verdict, finding Donald Trump guilty on all 34 felony counts in his hush money case. Again, keeping our lens entirely on the mechanics of media here, this is a moment where subjective political debate just stops and objective legal reality fully takes over. Following that verdict, Colbert walks out on his stage and delivers this exact line, "Convicted felon Donald Trump." And wow, the moment landed like a thunderclap. The audience's reaction wasn't just standard applause or your typical late-night laughter. It was an explosion. People were standing, shouting, and clapping for nearly a full minute. Why? Because those words required zero comedic setup. They required zero exaggeration. The weight of that phrase was anchored by real-world legal proceedings, including a scheduled sentencing date of July 11th set by the judge. The phrase, "convicted felon," was backed by a legally undeniable court verdict. It was completely impossible to brush off as a biased opinion or fake news.
The comedian didn't have to craft a clever spin anymore. He just had to repeat the literal truth, and the factual weight of the legal system did all the heavy lifting for him.
Section 4. Reality replaces comedy. Now, what's really interesting to break down here is the profound psychological shift in how the audience is engaging. Look at the contrast. Comedy relies entirely on timing. It needs setup, it needs exaggeration, and then, inevitably, it fades. But a court-mandated fact? That is permanent and undeniable. It requires absolutely no setup. It lands in the room like a reminder carved in stone that simply cannot be undone by a clever comeback. Because of this permanence, the audience actually developed a totally new 3-step ritual. Step 1, expectation. The crowd waits for Colbert to pause. Step 2, anticipation. The tension builds in that brief second of silence. Step 3, release. The crowd jumps in early, cheering before he even finishes the sentence. Notice that they aren't laughing here. They're reacting with something much louder, a massive release of political tension, as if years of complex national dialogue suddenly had a simple, factual label they could point to. And honestly, it all boils down to this core idea. The most devastating line isn't the one you write, it's the one reality hands you. The line between entertainment and reality completely disappeared in that studio. Because the label was already final and complete. It didn't rely on Colbert's tone, his delivery, or his context. It stood entirely on its own, a permanent title born from the courtroom, not the comedy writer's room. So the absolutely crucial point we're left with is this. When undeniable facts hit harder than written punchlines, what happens to the future of late-night satire? If reality is providing the heaviest material, how do entertainers adapt to a landscape where the simple truth commands a bigger reaction than the cleverest joke? It's a fascinating evolution of media, for sure, and one that will undoubtedly continue to shape how we consume news and entertainment. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep observing how the media around you continues to